that's going to be unpacking digital sequence information, which I know is a very complicated topic for many. And hopefully, by the end of this session, if you're still struggling with it, you'll have a better understanding. And for those of you who already understand it, you will also catch up on the policy side of it as well. I see in waste of time, I'm going to move over straight to our first speaker, who's a researcher from the Third World Network, to start us off and unpack exactly what is DSI and its applications up to date. Ting, over to your side.
Thank you very much, Simangele, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this session. I'm going to try to share my screen, so if you could let me know if you're seeing it. Yeah, okay. So I think really my task in this presentation is to introduce the topic of digital sequence information, or DSI, and to really look a little bit at some of its implications. I think in the simplest sense, DSI is really the order of chemicals in the DNA and RNA molecules in every living organism that carries the information that directs how life functions. Of course, many of us are familiar with DNA and RNA, but DSI also includes information associated with those DNA and RNA molecules, such as whether genes are turned on or off, how genes are assembled in a complex organism, and what functions they support or direct. So I think you can gather from this that this digital sequence information is actually very valuable information because it tells us a lot about living organisms, and scientists can use this information to develop useful products, for example, vaccines, or to identify useful and valuable traits in crop plants, for example. Apologies for that. So we've come to a situation where scientists are able to sequence the genomes of organisms. Now, sequencing is really about being able to read this information. And when all this started in the 1990s, the sequencing of a single genome of a complex organism cost many millions or even billions of US dollars and required years of work. The first fully sequenced organism was in 1995, which was a bacterium, already obviously a relatively simple organism, but containing about 1.8 million base pairs encoding 1,600 genes. In the next year, yeast was then sequenced, and you can see the number of base pairs and number of genes encoded has gone up quite a bit. And the first human genome was sequenced in 2003, and that took 13 years to sequence and cost 2.7 billion US dollars, and was a collaboration of many laboratories around the world. And of course, the human genome is made up of more than 3.1 billion base pairs, encoding more than 23,000 genes. So we've gone from this situation then in the 1990s to a situation now where genome sequencing has become much cheaper and much faster. So today, complex genomes, including that of a human, can be sequenced in hours and only for a few hundred US dollars. And scientists can carry inexpensive handheld devices into the field that can give them information on the DNA makeup of organisms, almost at the press of a button. And we've gone from a situation where scientists were sequencing one genome from one species to now very complex projects that can propose to sequence every species on Earth. And this is the Earth Biogenomic Project, for example. And of course, all this data now can be exchanged electronically, can be uploaded to the internet, or sent as an email attachment. So where do all these sequences go? Some, of course, stay at the lab where they were sequences and are just simply kept or hoarded. Many are posted onto these so-called open access databases, which are public databases. For example, the International Nucleotide Sequence Database Collaboration, INSDC, is a collaboration between the public databases of three countries and regions from the US, Japan, and the EU. And we need to note, of course, that it's largely the developed countries that are hosting these databases. And many of the sequences also go into proprietary or private databases. We don't know that much about these private databases, but these could, for example, be held by the big agriculture companies such as Syngenta or Monsanto. And we know that they are able to also access the sequences in the open access databases, and they complement this with their own collections. So you might ask, what's the big deal? What we're having is really a situation where there is free and easy access to these sequences, which contains valuable information, some of which could be of commercial benefit. However, there is no fair and equitable sharing of the benefits back to the countries that provided these genetic resources, and even less so to the indigenous peoples and local communities that have been conserving and sustainably using this biodiversity. So the technology has really transformed the way we access genetic resources. It literally bypasses the need for physical access and transfer of materials. In the old days, for example, a scientist would maybe have to go physically to, for example, if a scientist from the US came into my country, Malaysia, and collected a sample from our jungles and then brought it back to their labs, analyzed it for useful material, for example, if it's a medicinal plant, and say, okay, yeah, this can be used to make medicines. And we have situations where the smallest organisms, such as viruses, can now be recreated in a lab, and this is very useful, for example, for vaccine or drug development. Now, it's not currently possible to synthesize the more complex organisms such as plants from scratch. So scientists aren't going to be making new plants, but they can identify mutations that give plants desirable traits from their digital sequences, and then use new genetic techniques such as gene editing to introduce these mutations into commercial cultivars and develop valuable products. So what we're having and facing now is a situation of what I call digital biopiracy, where there's a loophole in access and benefit sharing laws, because most of this are based on physical transfer of materials. So for example, going back to that Malaysian example, whereby a scientist from the US has collected a valuable product from Malaysia, if they had done so and obtained a physical sample, they would have to go through our laws, and they would be obliged to have a material transfer agreement, be obliged to share benefits back with the country, and be obliged also to have to obtain the prior informed consent of indigenous peoples and local communities. Now, DSI has meant that these obligations for benefit sharing are bypassed. And because biodiversity largely lies in developing countries, and it is indigenous peoples and local communities who are safeguarding it, but yet they are not receiving the benefits. And I'm just going to very quickly highlight two examples from the health sector. Very relevant today, of course, COVID-19 vaccines. All of the vaccines in use today are dependent on DSI. They were physically generated directly from pathogen DSI. And of course, it was very important for these sequences to be shared so that scientists could really quickly develop the vaccines. And we've seen this happen with COVID-19. However, because there have been no obligations for benefit sharing, what we've seen is a very inequitable situation where COVID vaccine companies are banking billions, and wealthy countries have been able to enjoy easy access to vaccines. But as we know, for many developing countries, there has been inequitable access to vaccines. And not only that, they also have to pay a lot of money to be able to procure and purchase these vaccines. Another example is the Ebola drug Inmazet, which is produced by the US pharmaceutical company Regeneron. Now, it developed this drug using the DSI of an Ebola virus strain from the clinical sample of a Ghanaian patient. Now, Regeneron was able to download the sequence from an open access database because the sequence was posted by a research institute there. It was able to synthesize portions of the virus and use them to create the drug, which is, of course, is very useful and very valuable and can save lives. However, Regeneron has also patented the drug and secured deals worth over $400 million for it, but has been under no obligation to share the resulting benefits with the country of origin of the virus strain, which is Guinea. So this is really an inequitable situation. So what are the implications? I think, firstly, that this whole situation undermines the CBD's third objective, which is the fair and equitable sharing of the benefit arising from the utilization of genetic resources. And it also undermines national ABS laws, because basically we have a situation where the technology has far outpaced the legal requirements and obligations. It has also made it more difficult to detect and prevent biopiracy, because all this is happening largely electronically, through the internet, through the cloud, through these databases. It's reduced the opportunity to generate resources for biodiversity conservation, because now, rather than the benefits being shared back with the countries which have been safeguarding the biodiversity, or with the communities that have been safeguarding the biodiversity, they're being captured instead, for example, by pharmaceutical companies. And this has resulted in increased corporate control over biodiversity. And I think from our perspective, we really need an urgent solution that puts in place a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism for DSI under the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. We very strongly feel that repositories of DSI, such as the databases, should require the users to agree to benefit sharing, make benefit sharing an obligation, and ensure that the rights of genetic resource providers are protected. And that such a system could collect payments for the commercial use of DSI into a fund, which would support particularly Indigenous peoples and local communities, who are the ones protecting our biodiversity. I'm sure Pierre will say a lot more about this in the current negotiations under the CBD, so I'll just end there by saying thank you very much.
Thank you so much for setting the stage for us and giving that clarity, and especially with recent, examples of the application of DSI, which for a lot of people do not understand. Yes, Pierre, I'll move over to your side. Why does this matter so much for Africa, and especially in the post-2020?
Oh dear.
I can see your screen and I can hear you saying, "Oh dear." So your sound is fine.
You can hear me. That's very good, because after I started screen sharing, I couldn't find the unmute button. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you, Ching. That was a very good summary. And so I'm going to skip over parts of my presentation that are probably repetitions of what you had to say, and try and focus more on the African perspective. Just a quick recap on what the post-2020 global biodiversity framework is, which is a stepping stone towards living in harmony with nature by 2050. And this is supposed to bring about a transformative change in the way we deal with biodiversity. And from an African perspective, it's really important that it deals with all three of the CBD objectives in a balanced and holistic manner. And I think in that regard, it's very important to realize that the CBD was never intended to be a conservation instrument primarily. It has always been about sustainable development. And if you look at the three objectives of the CBD, this benefit sharing, which includes capacity development, technology transfer, and funding, is supposed to provide sustainable development pathways for developing countries, including Africa. And so, and that will then result in conservation. And so it's very important that the benefit sharing part of the CBD is honored and carried out, because that's key to the sustainability of not only biodiversity, but also of development that doesn't harm biodiversity. Well, I'm just going to say that following on what Ching said, the DSI, as it is currently being discussed, is only a placeholder term. it's not only being discussed in the CBD, it's also at the FAO and at the World Health Organization and in the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, high seas discussion at the United Nations General Assembly. But very, very simply, if you, without getting tied up in terminology, in fact, what DSI is simply the utilization of genetic resources as it is done today. Almost every branch of biology uses digital sequence information. And it's an amazingly powerful tool. I mean, it enables things to us to do things that we could never have imagined 30 years ago when the CBD was negotiated. So the ad hoc technical expert group on DSI came up with some a grouping of potential understandings of DSI, which are summarized in this slide. And as you move from left to right on this slide, the link between the original genetic resource and the information becomes weaker and weaker, and it becomes harder and harder to work back towards the original genetic resource. I'm not going to go into the details of this at the moment. It's far too technical. But if you want, I mean, the presentations will be available later for careful reading. I think Ching explained quite well why DSI is important for ABS, because it is now so easy to bypass ABS regulations through accessing the genetic resources from the international databases. And there's also the important equity element, which is that developing countries do not have the technical capacity to look at, to use their DSI in the same way that developed countries have. And so all of the value from using DSI is retained in developed countries and protected by intellectual property. For Africa in particular, Africa is, I mean, firstly, we have a lot of biodiversity that's very relevant because of the link between human evolution and Africa. So that's an important consideration. It's also that Africa is the youngest continent in the world and that our population is going to double by 2050. And it's also the only part of the world that is not going to get any younger. Also, there's a question about how this African population is going to be accommodated. Where will we live? Will we live in slums? Will we live in eco-villages? Will there be, what will happen to rural people? What will happen to environments and habitats under the pressure of population growth? How can we deal with that? And I mean, there's the other part of it, which is an equity consideration, which is that much of the modern world has been shaped by colonial plantation agriculture and the industrial revolution that was then based on that, and initially involved like chattel slavery from Africa to the Americas to grow these new industrial crops and so on. And so there's a very deep-seated historical injustice behind ABS in general, right? And ABS as a concept evolved out of a decolonization narrative about taking back control over natural resources, etc. And in that regard, Africa has this Agenda 2063 blueprint and master plan for transforming Africa into the global powerhouse of the future. I said that's an agreed continental plan to build up Africa as a knowledge-based economy. And of course, in that context, our genetic resources and access to those genetic resources and the technologies to use them for our own development is very important. So on DSI, Africa has developed some positions, and one of the most important one of them is that we have maintained sort of consistently so far that if there's no solution for benefit sharing for DSI in the global biodiversity framework, we will not agree to the adoption of that framework. So no DSI, no framework. And it seems that our negotiating partners are taking this seriously. It's mainly about sharing the monetary benefits. The non-monetary benefits, I think, are fairly well covered. I mean, not the technology transfer and capacity development sides of that need some work, but it really is about sharing the monetary benefits. And we have proposed that the best way to do this would be through a multilateral benefit sharing system that captures the some 1% of the retail value of all biodiversity-linked products sold in developed countries, and then use that money to support biodiversity positive activities in developing countries. And so we've come up with quite a detailed proposal for a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, which has been a long-term African demand. For example, in Article 10 of the Nagoya Protocol, that was one of the reasons why Africa agreed to accept the Nagoya Protocol. So there are now there is a process underway in the CBD to look at policy options, and they are summarized in this table. Again, it's very, very far from time constraints and so on. I can't go into the details of this. But if you look down here at policy option number 6, that's the African proposal. 1% levy on retail sales of genetic resources into a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism. And we are engaging in the process of doing a multi-criteria analysis of those policy options against criteria and sub-criteria, which is summarized in this table. And I think at the moment, the sort of headline agreement is that open access should not be unnecessarily compromised, that research should not become more difficult, and that benefit sharing must happen. Process is doing a multi-criteria analysis of those policy options against criteria and sub-criteria, which is summarized. No, I can hear myself. I don't know. I think at the moment,
I think someone is unmuted and they're listening to you both in Zoom and in ME.
Can you
kindly unmute yourself?
Yeah. The research should not become more difficult, and the benefit sharing must.
Ida, please.
Of those policy options against criteria.
Cherise, please mute Ida. Thanks.
So to move on then, there's an informal advisory group has been formed to look at the agreements and disagreements around DSI. This group will be expanded to include more stakeholder representatives. And it will continue working until the 4th meeting of the open-ended working group in Nairobi in June. And then possibly also after that towards COP15. And really Africa's like top priority in these negotiations is to ensure that there are sufficient resources available for the implementation of the framework. And we have put various proposals on the table around resource mobilization, not just the multilateral benefit sharing mechanism. And we have made it clear that we will tie our ambition in the rest of the framework to the extent to which resources are available. Now, just very quickly, the resources that are available from developed countries directly from their taxes are very unreliable and very small amounts, right? I mean, they've just like done another round for the Global Environment Facility where they came up with $5 billion US, and the estimate for what is needed to save biodiversity is $700 billion US. So there's a very big disconnect, and we believe that by bringing in money directly from businesses into biodiversity conservation, we will get a much better outcome in the long run. And that's the African position. I've put a link in here for some DSI resources that are available on the CBD website. Thank you very much for your time and for listening to me.
Thank you so much for articulating that so clearly. I would love to check in the floor if there are any questions. This is a topic that I've seen a lot of times. A lot of people are not informed about, especially youth, yet it is so crucial. From the side of us who are here, who are representatives of youth networks, what are some of the things that you think we can do? One, to build awareness on it, and also I think more actively to be involved in it, right? Because DSI is a tool that has a potential, if used well, to provide solutions to a lot of challenges we face today. It has a potential to contribute to resource mobilization for the post-2020 and so on. Perhaps what do you see as the role of us as youth networks and representatives in pioneering this? And yeah, that would be my first question.
Okay, thanks. I think, yeah, I'll try and answer that. I think as the youth networks, it would be, as you said, very important to raise awareness of this issue. I think for many people, sometimes when they think about DSI, they think, oh, it's a really complicated issue. And of course, it's complex. But at the very crux of this is really about fairness and equity. Because we know that most biodiversity lies in developing countries, most biodiversity, it is indigenous peoples and local communities who are conserving and sustainably using biodiversity. So if there are any commercial products that are developed that reaps commercial benefits, and of course companies, are doing this, then it really is a question of justice to share these benefits back with the countries who have been providing the resources and with the communities who have been safeguarding it. So that is really the crux of the issue. And we know that I think people may be familiar with the term biopiracy, and there are many very well-known examples of biopiracy that has happened, where products are developed, but the communities have not received the benefits, or the countries that have provided resources have not received the benefits. And we can think of things like patents over basmati rice, for example, or neem. There are many, beans, for example, in different countries. So the thing that we just need to get our heads around now, as Pierre has said, is that in today's world, all of biology is using sequence information, and it's using DSI, and they're able to access these sequences quite easily, and yet can bypass benefit sharing obligations. So if we can get a good youth understanding and awareness of this issue, I think that would be important to also put pressure, at the negotiations, to say to governments that, look, we're watching, and we want a fair deal for indigenous peoples and local communities, for developing countries. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Pierre, I'll move over to your side for the same question. And I see there was another question directed to you. You can address that one as well.
Okay, thanks, Mangele. I basically agree with Ching that it's largely an equity issue, but it is also a resource mobilization issue, right? I mean, we do need a lot more resources. Every time, there's a global recession, or there's a war, or there's a pandemic or something, then the developed countries don't have the money to pay for biodiversity conservation. So we need to break out of that, dependence on the developed countries to fund biodiversity conservation. And I think that that's an important part of the equity dimension, right? Is that it's not just about a transfer of money, it is about a transfer of opportunities to developing countries. And I think that that's actually really where the potential for youth involvement is very, very large, because you are the digital generation, right? I mean, you grew up with universal almost access to large information sets and so on. And you are the people who are going to inherit the mess that our generation made, and you are going to need the full toolbox to deal with that. And so you are the generation that can take the promise of DSI and all the things you can do with DSI and use that to address a whole lot of global problems. But to do that, you need to understand what it is, and you need to put in place a mechanism, for securing technology transfer and for securing capacity development. And I would say go and study bioinformatics, right? Study genetics, because that is a very large and important thing in the future. The question that was addressed to me is to clarify what the $700 billion US dollars is for. No, it's not for, was it to restore biodiversity completely? No, it's not to restore biodiversity completely. It's basically to meet the sort of headline objectives of the global biodiversity framework. In other words, to effectively protect 30% of land and sea, and to do all of the other things. And a big part of that is removing all of the damaging subsidies that are currently being paid to agriculture, and to fossil fuels, and to infrastructure development that do harm biodiversity. And there's a range of estimates, sort of from under 400 billion to over a trillion. But the average figure, and the figure that is now being used officially by the CBD Secretariat, is actually 712 billion US dollars here. So, yeah, I mean, how long is a piece of string, right? I mean, so the current resource mobilization strategy in the global biodiversity framework says reduce the harmful subsidies by 500 billion, increase funding from all sources to 200 billion, and use the resources that are available more efficiently, so that you get a bigger bang for your buck. But I mean, the figure, the sort of the consensus figure, or the average figure, is that we need around 700 billion a year to do that, to actually, and that's why it needs to be a transformative change, right? It cannot be done by drip feeding, 10 billion here and 15 billion there into the global environment facility. We really need to fundamentally shift something in the economy, so that those who benefit from using biodiversity pays for the conservation of biodiversity, and pays for development opportunities to alleviate poverty and help developing countries to grow, but in a way that doesn't rely on cutting down the rainforests and replacing them with genetically modified soybeans or something.
Thank you so much to both our speakers. I know this was a very short session, and usually you need a lot of time to unpack and respond to questions on these things, but I hope that attendees who are with us today, both from the side of Meet and on Zoom, were able to get the basic understanding of DSI, its applications historically, in the current context and in the future going forward, and actually see the linkage between this and resource mobilization for biodiversity, seeing this also as a matter of justice in looking at what is happening with the existing benefit sharing mechanisms and how this in a way is allowing for the bypass of that. I can assure that from the side of a lot of young people that I engage with, this is a topic we are following closely. We followed it closely. I think it's disappointing to say we've been following it since Egypt or before that, and it's so slow in development, although we are very hopeful, but we are really hoping that a lot of progress will be made as we go to OEWG4 in Nairobi. So for my side, thank you so much for making the time, and thanks to the colleagues who joined, and have a great day ahead.